Good afternoon, everyone. I am Maria Rosa Vaquerizo. I'm the CEO of the Andean American Associations. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you today to this program, a very important and very pertinent program. Also, I would like to welcome, and we're very pleased to have over 150 registrants. And we all want to wish you and your family a healthy and safety time. It's a very trying time for everyone. Few words about the Andean American Associations. We are the first chambers of commerce for our region in the US. We have been a forum for over 90 years. And together we have hosted over 1,000 programs. Today, we are honored to have the participation of a very distinguished panel. For Colombia, we have Dr. Jose Antonio Ocampo. For Ecuador, we have Walter Escurrier Vaquerizo. For Peru, we have Diego Macera. And for Venezuela, we have Ross Dallin. And our moderator, Dr. Alejo Cherwonko. I would also like to thank the presidents of our associations that have worked in helping in preparing this webinar. We're honored to have today Stephanie Jonger-Moat of the Colombian American Association, Juana Caicedo Selinger of the Ecuadorian American Association, and Ana Julia Hatar of the Venezuelan American Association. And now I would like to turn over the program to Alejo Cherwonko, Executive Director and Emerging Market Strategies of UBS. He will briefly introduce the speakers and guide the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Maria Rosa, thank you so much for the great introduction. I think we have a terrific lineup for today. I think the plan is fairly straightforward. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be covering 4 countries. We have 1 speaker per country. The game plan is as follows. We will dedicate 10 minutes to Colombia, 10 minutes to Ecuador, 10 minutes to Peru, and we'll wrap up with 10 minutes talking about Venezuela. After that, we will be taking questions from the audience. You can submit your questions through the question and answer functionality in Zoom. And we will try to wrap up the whole program within the 1.5-hour time frame. So thank you very much for joining. And without further ado, I want to welcome our speaker, distinguished speaker for the topic of Colombia, Dr. Jose Antonio Ocampo. As you all know, Professor Jose Antonio Ocampo is a full-time professor at Columbia University, the School of International and Public Affairs, among many other responsibilities that we'd be spending too much time to describe today. The full biographies are available in the invitation. Jose Antonio, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. Maria Rosa, thank you for the invitation. And Alejo, thank you for the moderation. Let me start by saying that Colombia is facing, aside from the coronavirus shock, let's say, other difficult circumstances, particularly the collapse of oil prices, which is, of course, our major export and a major source of fiscal revenues for the country. And then the uncertainties associated to external financing, although I must say that portfolio flows don't seem to have been particularly negative so far for Colombia relative to the trend for emerging markets as a whole. Now, the effects of the coronavirus, as we know, are very strong during the lockdown. So the lockdown, Colombia adopted a full lockdown very early on because the number of people affected so far by the pandemics is relatively small, relative even to other countries here. For example, much less than Ecuador or Peru, for example. and the number of people who have died are quite limited. But the government decided to go through a very early lockdown. So we have been for a full lockdown for about a month. Actually, yesterday was the transition to a let's say a selective lockdown, because some workers from manufacturing and construction are now allowed to work. But there is a lot of restrictions still in many cities, which are determined really by the mayors of those cities. Now, the major effect on economic activity is associated to the lockdown. And so there has been estimates that a full month of a lockdown may affect economic activity by, let's say, something like in the order of 5% of GDP. So it's actually quite significant. In any case, the estimated effects of the lockdown in Colombia and of the crisis in Colombia in general are some of the, it's a contraction, let's say, the order of 3% of GDP, of our GDP, which is relatively small compared to other countries in the region. This is the estimate by the IMF, by the World Bank, by CEPAL also. We have been made public in the last few weeks. Now, in front of that, of the situation, the government has put in place, the government and the central bank, Banco de la República, put in place, let's say, a program that I would say includes, first of all, to mention the Banco de la República, a significant amount or a major liquidity injection into the economy, and a significant intervention in the foreign exchange market. The results of this have been actually quite positive, including the relative stabilization of the exchange rate, which underwent in the first few days of the crisis a significant depreciation. In the case of the public, of the government, it has introduced, first of all, a fiscal package, which I would say is in the order of 2.5% of GDP. That includes a significant amount of resources also for the health system. Also, several programs for the poor and vulnerable. Initially, the conditional cash transfers that were generally in place, both for poor families as well for older people and young people who are studying. But the government also introduced a new program called Ingreso Solidario, Solidarity Income, that will affect, will benefit about 3 million households of vulnerable population. So in total, the government is aiming at something in the order of 6 million families with some resources, which I think are very limited in the amount. For example, the Ingreso Solidario is about $60 per family per month, which I think is very small relative to the needs, and particularly to the major problem, which is the fact that the people who are informal or independent essentially have no income during the lockdown. So that's a really major effect that we have of a social character. There is not as such an employment program or a program to support particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises, keeping their workers during the lockdown. But the government has been introducing several financial credit lines to our second-tier banks, to our development banks, and particularly Bancoldex, and at the same time has offered a significant amount of warranties for banks that lend to the sectors in crisis and then to small enterprises. Actually, if anything, the really large program is the warranty program, which is equivalent to about 8% of GDP. So it must be one of the largest, if not the largest, in Latin America, actually, in terms of resources. There's a lot of discussion, however, about whether the financial sector is really offering the credits that they are supposed to associated to these programs of the government. Now, a major question mark is, of course, the sources of for the public sector. And in that regard, let me say that aside from the additional spending, which may be in the order of 2.5% of GDP so far, there is an expectation of a fall in tax revenues of also about 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So there is a significant increase in the public sector deficit, as I guess in all countries. And the crucial question is how it's going to be financed. I mean, so far it has been financed in two ways. Well, three ways actually. Some by external financing from the multilateral development banks. The second, the government use or borrow from some of the funds that are supposed to be from the municipalities and the departments. So it's a big question mark about how long that will take from the point of view of the local governments. And the third is a forced credits from the financial sector, which were associated to a benefit that they got, which was a reduction in the reserve requirements. So the reduction in reserve requirement generated a monetary expansion, and the government captured that through a form of forced spending. So it has been a big question mark is about the government directly or buying government bonds in the primary market, right? The secondary market. That's one point. And the second is whether the simple credit line that Colombia has with the IMF could be eventually used as a sort of financing for the public sector. So let me close my intervention here within my time limit.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. One follow-up question. We have 1 or 2 minutes left, but many of our clients are, for instance, concerned about the sovereign credit rating of Colombia. As you know, after a recent set of adjustments, Colombia is rated by 2 major rating agencies at BBB- with negative outlook. Do you think the investment grade rating can be preserved? And does this matter briefly?
Well, it's a big question mark. I mean, there is, of course, the risk that Colombia will lose the investment grade. But so far, I think that expectation will take many months if it materializes. So for the time being, I think Colombia will keep the investment grade. And I think it can go to the market actually to borrow. I mean, Mexico was very successful in its recent bond issue, and Colombia should probably go. Ecopetrol, the oil company of Colombia, has already gone to the market, and they got, I think, good conditions.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. Very clear. I would agree with that. You saw the higher quality sovereigns being able to tap the markets in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and Colombia should be no exception in that regard. Very good. Let's then move on to Ecuador. Walter Spurrier Vaquerizo, an economic analyst with a master's in economics at UCLA, is with us today to focus on the country. Thank you, Walter, for being with us. First question to you. Of course, Ecuador has been one of the worst hit countries in the region. What is your assessment of the economic and healthcare cost of this crisis?
Thank you, Alejo, for having me here. Hello to my fellow panelists and to all who are listening to us. Yes, Ecuador, or to be more precise, just as in North America, New York has been particularly hit. Also, the COVID entered Latin America through Guayaquil, where I'm stationed. And costs have been huge. We have not been able to handle the crisis properly. And the brunt of the pandemic is beginning to spread and the hinterland, Guayaquil's hinterland. In other words, other towns and rural areas of the coast, they are also engaged into agribusiness for export and also fisheries. Not so much in the highlands. There, it's not too different from what is happening in neighboring countries. Now, we're in a particularly bad economic shape. We were in a bad economic shape before COVID struck. We had an agreement with the IMF, but we were having trouble into meeting our adjustment under that agreement. Then COVID hit. It started with a collapse of the price of oil. That took about 2% of GDP out of our revenues. Much depends on how the price goes on in the rest of the year, of course. Then our reaction, as in other countries, has been entering a lockdown. And lockdown, of course, has a huge impact on business activity. Most businesses locked down. And therefore, what government is going to collect from VAT and further on, income tax is going to drop substantially. Let's say some other 3 GDP points at least. And then our budget, the stability in our budget was hinging on some concessions of some government assets, including selling a state-owned bank that should bring some $2 billion. And of course, that's off schedule right now. So the impact of the pandemic is at least 7 GDP points, in addition to the problem we had before. So we're really very badly hit. And estimates from the World Bank, the IMF, ECLAC, so municipal, all point to between 6 and 6.5% of GDP points that the economy would drop this year. And there are other estimates which are more pessimistic.
Thank you, Walter. In this context, as you rightly pointed out, Ecuador's fiscal position is going from bad to worse. How do you envision the country managing its relationship with the IMF and private creditors in the coming quarters?
Well, with the IMF, the crisis struck us at a bad time because in March, when they were reviewing our 2019 figures, there some inconsistencies appeared. Apparently, reporting from local governments and other non-central government institutions had not been very clearly stated, that there were some inconsistencies, and so the disbursement that was to be made in March for our extended agreement was withheld. So right now, since we have a different reality, the agreement with the IMF has to be renegotiated. We have to come up with a new agreement, taking into account the new realities, such as the pandemic. And we do expect, however, considerable support from the IMF and international community, and it will probably come, but still hasn't arrived yet. We're in a particular bad situation there, since, as you know, we're dollarized. We have a very little in terms of international reserves, and the reserves we have is mainly private bank deposits, which are deposits from the public. And the government has has actually no option to bring liquidity into the economy. They cannot engage into quantitative easing the way other countries have done. So we do need urgently foreign funds of credit. Under these circumstances, the government had to go back on its pledge not to enter a debt-to-provided process, and has had to ask creditors to accept us putting off paying, servicing the debt until August. Now, with the dire situation Ecuador is living in, we should expect creditors should expect, they probably expect it already, that Ecuador is going to make a proposal to put off any payment. Some debt reprofiling, they would put off any debt servicing for the next few years, and probably also with some haircut and exchange of current bonds with a longer-term bond. That's what should be expected. There's nothing black and white right now.
Thank you. Looking into 2021, the country is scheduled to face elections. Do you have a view on how this shock is impacting the outlook for the electoral process?
No, I don't. I don't think anybody has, because we were going towards an election in which we could have expected. Remember, we have a runoff. You could expect that probably former President Correa would put a stand-in of his, so one of his, perhaps a sister, to run for his party. They had a strong support and had a very good chance of making it to the runoff. And the expectations were that the other candidate that would enter the runoff would be from a center to the right spectrum, where you have two major candidates, at least one, Guillermo Lasso, a banker, a former banker who's already running, and the other from the Social Christian Party, the strongest party in Ecuador, whose head, which is Jaime Nebot, has not yet decided, or still has not announced a decision to run. It would probably, the second person in the runoff would come from that sector, and that person would have the first option of winning the election on account of winning the runoff on account of the negative vote for President Correa. However, right now, everybody's thinking about the health crisis, and that may affect the way people vote. People will have to, the population will have to come up with an idea of how the present government has dealt with the crisis, or may have come out with different ideas of how the crisis should be handled. So I would say the race presently is wide open.
Thank you. Since we have a couple more minutes left for Ecuador, let me bring in one question from the audience already. Is the government doing enough to support the tourism sector in the country?
Well, the government is not doing enough to support any sector in the country because the government doesn't have any money. Actually, as I mentioned, they're not doing any quantitative easing. They're not helping business meet their payrolls as other countries are doing. Some of our fellow countries in this panel are doing that. On the other hand, the government is proposing taxing business in order to meet its expenditures, is passing on to business the solution to the crisis. Tourist sector, what could you do with the tourist sector? I mean, people who are coming to Ecuador have canceled, of course, all the reservations. And you cannot expect them to bring in new reservations within 2 or 3 months. I mean, that's going to take some time until everything gets normalized. We don't even know if tourism, global tourism, is going to recover the way it was before the pandemic. So no, they're not doing enough. They would like to. Tourism is the sector that's more close to the heart of the president, because when he was the only occasion he was in private business was running a family-owned little hotel. But they're not doing enough, and we cannot expect them to do anything for it.
Thank you very much. Let's then move on now to Peru. We have Diego Macera. He's the General Manager at the Peruvian Institute of Economics. Diego, thank you so much for joining. First question for you. There is a perception that Peru is doing a relatively better job than other Latin American countries at handling the pandemic. Do you think this perception is by and large accurate?
Hi, Alejo. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the Latin American associations. I think it used to be the case of what you're mentioning. I think the initial response of Peru was swift, was fast, was drastic, and was also taken very early on in the pandemic. Some people even thought it may have been a little bit rushed because of how harsh the policy was a complete lockdown from day one when we really had a few dozen cases confirmed. So many people thought it maybe was an overreaction on part of the president, but turns out, as the weeks went by, he may have been right in have such a harsh policy response initially. Now, that gave also the president a major boost in its popularity. Now, as the last measures that were taken, the last polls, was placing him in almost 90% approval, which is absolutely historic for Peru, and is really high for Latin American standards. It was, if I remember correctly, it was around 87% approval rating, which has given him also some extra strength when discussing policies that may be a little bit harsher or a little bit more unpopular to implement during the pandemic. So that has been the case. A very good initial response that gave the president some kind of political boost. Now, that necessarily wears down, and you may have a political boost initially, but then you have to manage the crisis, and that's not the same. The impression, I think, has been, as weeks and days have gone by, that the management of the crisis has not been the best. There has been, to be fair, Peru has structural problems, such as many of the countries in the region, to face an issue like this. We started with a very, very weak healthcare system. I would say weaker than most of the countries represented here. We had fewer ventilators per person than Colombia, than Mexico, than Chile, than Ecuador. We were understaffed, especially in public hospitals, and that's on the part of the healthcare system. But on the part of the economy, we also have over 70% of informal workers. That's the highest rate in the region, only topped by Bolivia. So this prevalence of the informal economy has also made it hard for government to enforce and administer drastic lockdown measures, and has also made hard for government to provide some kind of economic relief to a lot of companies and a lot of people that are not really on any database, are not really on any payroll, or are really hard to identify. So I would say those two structural problems, the weak healthcare system and the informal economy, has complicated further the management problems that the government have faced during the last weeks. As far as the management problems specifically, we have had really low capacity for testing and tracking cases. So far, we have about 28,000 cases confirmed and almost 800 deaths, which it really depends on if you're looking at the glass half full or half empty. You could look at it as half full and saying, hey, maybe 800 deaths in a country of 32 million people is not really that much. But you then also have to look at it in the perspective that we have been in absolute lockdown for 6 weeks. So you really don't have the counterfactual of how high would these cases or deaths would have been if we have not been so harsh since mid-March. There has been a lack of ability to organize the healthcare system and an effective response in part of hospitals and all the frameworks that go around building a mechanism that effectively provide health provision. This, however, will be more noticeable as the days go by and as a saturation of the hospitals really start to kick in the population. Now, as far as economic responses, now that's the side in which I'm really not a specialist. I'm not a doctor. I'm an economist. So on the side of the economic policy responses, the government has been somewhat more sound than on the health issue. We have had already liquidity provision, some credit lines for 30 billion soles, almost $10 billion, about 4 to 5% of GDP put through the central bank and channeled through the commercial banking to be put into small companies, tiny companies, large, it doesn't really matter, up to a loan of about $3 million. That's the maximum loan allowed. However, these lines were also put in a cap of about 1 month. The average monthly sales of last year, that was the maximum amount that you could borrow at this from these lines, which will be not enough for a lot of companies. This limit was set when the quarantine was supposed to last 2 weeks, and now we're looking at a 2 months quarantine. So it has increased significantly on the time that we are going to be in this lockdown, and therefore it has also increased significantly the magnitude of the economic impact that this will have. We are looking at negative interest rate, real interest rates, negative. So it's about, in nominal terms, these lines are going to be placed in about 1 to 2% interest rate. So it is extremely competitive. It is, I think the central bank here did an excellent job. And of course, these lines are guaranteed by Treasury from rates that go from 80% to 98% of guarantee. So this has been on the liquidity part. Fiscal policy in general has been very, very aggressive. Peru, thanks to decades of good macroeconomic management, has good access to international markets. We placed sovereign bonds for about $3 billion about a week and a half ago. They were very well received by international investors, and that will certainly help finance our ambitious economic package that is estimated in about 8% of GDP. So in fiscal stimulus, Peru's estimating about 8% GDP spending, plus another 4 to 5 in credit lines. That by itself could be about 12%. So we're really making an effort here. What's been lacking, it's some kind of more flexibility in labor markets. We have an incredibly rigid labor market. Well, it's not only a problem of Peru, some of the other countries in the region have it too, but the Minister of Labor have been reluctant to release or to have some consideration into the payroll of companies that are really struggling, restaurants, hotels. The lockdown here, as opposed to other countries in the region, really has been absolute. The only exceptions are, well, of course, food and food manufacturing, banking, energy, medicine, but it's only for activities considered essential for the sustainable of modern life. All the rest, construction, any other type of manufacturing, mining, fishing, agriculture that is for export, everything has been paralyzed. And that has been the case for the last 6 weeks, and that will probably be the case for this week. And hopefully on May 4th, we could start seeing some improvements, but it's still very unclear the way that this will follow. Every week on this situation is about 1% of GDP for us. That's a gross estimation, but I think it works good works well as a rule of thumb. So we're talking. So initially, the latest IMF figures put the contraction of GDP in Peru at around 4.5%. Internally, the figures of reduction of GDP for 2020 are closer to 8%, 9%, even 10%, because just this 8 weeks of total lockdown, just that will cost you easily 8% of GDP. So we are talking about huge magnitudes here. As far as economic relief for vulnerable families, the government has put in place some transfers of about $200 per family, $200, and this has been also it's been called bono universal. So like by semantics, everyone should get it. They've really only excluded from this transfer those households that have someone in the formal payroll, in a formal company, being a formal employee and still getting their salary, their wages. They have been excluded, but that accounts for about 20 to 25% of families in the country. So we estimate that about 75% of households are receiving this $200 stimulus, this help. cope with the 2 months of lockdown that we have ahead. This has been really hard for thousands of families. And the real problem is that we still don't have a clear path on opening the economy for the next weeks.
Thank you, Diego, very much. And now to complete the tour around the Andean region, we've got Russ Dallin, Managing Partner at Caracas Capital Markets. Thank you, Russ, very much for joining us. The opening question for you is, if you can walk us through the situation on the ground. Last night, Venezuela reported that a grand total of 329 people have been infected so far. Is this accurate? What do you think is the real picture in Venezuela?
So you saved the worst or the best for last. I don't know. It depends on how you look at it. You're correct that is what they reported. They reported 2 new yesterday. 10 are dead so far, and 128 have recovered. That is according to the government's official numbers. Their first case came on March 14th, and then they put down a lockdown a couple of days later. The first death was on the 26th of March, according to the government statistics. The problem is that the government also says it's done over 200,000 tests, and it's doing 25,000 a day. Some of our reporters, I also run the Daily Journal. It used to be the Daily Journal of Caracas, but now it's called the Latin American Herald Tribune. And all the tests have to be completed at the National Institute of Health in Venezuela's downtown, in a small 3-story building, very old. The most that they can do a day is probably 100. So checking a test. So there's some disbelief in their claim that they're doing 25,000 tests a day, which also casts doubt on the numbers, but it is what we have to work with. We believe there's a lot higher death toll and a lot more cases than that. I mean, for example, in doing 200,000 tests that Venezuela has claimed, Peru has done 143,000 tests and found 15,000 positive cases. So for Venezuela to have 329 defies some of the statistical reasonability of their numbers. But the worst thing for Venezuela is that that this whole pandemic comes about 6 years into one of the worst economic collapses in recent history by any country that's not at war. 1 in 3 Venezuelans currently doesn't have enough to eat. The nutritional requirements, I should say, not just enough to eat, but the nutritional requirements that are needed to sustain life in Venezuela. The doctors lack the basic supplies in the hospital, like gloves and running water. Electricity is sometimes not there as well. And even patients sometimes have to bring their own light bulbs because there are no light bulbs in the hospital. It's a sad situation. For that reason, we think that Venezuela's numbers are somewhat suspect, and not even meeting the global 3% kind of average that we have. To make matters worse, oil prices have collapsed as well as Venezuela's oil production. According to OPEC, last month, Venezuela produced 660,000 barrels. That is down from 3.5 million barrels when Chavez came to power in 1998 when he was elected. On top of that, with the prices falling because of COVID, all over we have demand destruction. The Venezuelan oil basket was trading under $10 officially, is what they said, at $9.98. But the ventures in the field who are actually doing that now, actually producing the oil and selling it for the government, have been selling barrels of oil at $2 a barrel last week. So even $10 is an estimate. But to put that in perspective, 98% of Venezuela's revenue comes from oil. If they're producing 660,000 barrels per day, which is less than 20% of what they were producing 22 years ago before Chavez came to power. If they're producing 66,000 at $10, you're talking about 6.7 million barrels. $6.7 million a day for a country of 30 million. That's less, and that's the main earnings for the whole country. That's less than 22 cents a person in the country, and on a yearly basis, it's only going to be $2.4 billion for the whole country. So they're in sad, bad shape, and this couldn't have happened at a worse time. The World Bank was already estimating that Venezuela's GDP would collapse another 15% this year pre-COVID. And let me put that in perspective, because over the last 6 years that we're talking about this debacle that the economy is going through, they have had basically 64% decline in GDP. We have some estimates that are higher and put it in the 90s, but the IMF actually has numbers that show it's in the high 90s. But if we just use those more basic numbers of 64%, to put that in perspective, in the first years of the global depression, the depression in the United States, which is kind of our standard of which we all can refer to in the last century and a half, GDP fell 29% over those first 4 or 5 years, 29%. Venezuela, even by the most conservative estimates, has fallen over 64%. So that gives you some idea of the devastation in the country that's going on, even before we've added the COVID to the equation.
Those are pretty scary numbers. Let me ask you, moving into the murky realm of politics, how can Maduro stay in power with Venezuelan crude at $2 a barrel?
That's the great question, and it's something that we ask ourselves in disbelief a lot. But we look at Cuba, and there's still a Castro driving that boat. As devastated as their economy has been, as much of a toll that sanctions from the United States have taken on that country, there's still a Castro captaining that ship. Venezuela still has some democratic reflex left in it. But Maduro is scared and worried. The economic reserves of the country, the international reserves, have fallen back to the level that the country first achieved in 1974. They're at $6.3 billion, and we're not even, we don't have a high level of confidence in that number, much less the COVID numbers. And some of that money that they claim to have is actually held. For example, $1.3 billion in gold of that 6.3 is held in England, which has no intention of, which does not recognize the Maduro regime and has no intention of turning the gold over to. So it's kind of a chimera. There's that gold is, that money is not really available, but it shows how far they've drawn down their balance. They had as high as $43 billion just 8-9 years ago in that international reserves count. So you can see things got so bad actually that after the late last month, they asked the IMF for a loan of $5 billion. Now, they'd already borrowed all of their special drawing rights from the IMF, as well as on top of some other money that they had from the IMF. The IMF politely declined and said that they weren't sure. There was some contention as to who was the actual president of the country, and so they weren't capable of making a decision right now. So the situation is bad, and all the red light indicators on this car are blinking red, check engine lights, but Maduro is still in place, but he must not be sleeping very well, I don't think.
Thank you very much, Russ. So with that, we conclude the initial comments for all 4 countries. We have a very engaging audience. A good number of questions have been coming in. So let me start with one for Jose Antonio on Colombia. Our dear friend Luis Oganes is asking the following. Jose Antonio, you described the double whammy of the pandemic and lower oil prices on Colombia's fiscal accounts, which will increase the fiscal deficit substantially. Banco de la República has some ability to buy test bonds in the secondary market. Do you expect it to embark in more aggressive test purchases, which could help to finance the fiscal deficit and flatten the yield curve, almost like quantitative easing that we see elsewhere in the world? Jose Antonio.
Well, that's a good question, and it's a heated debate in Colombia, by the way. Let me say that I think the possibility of borrowing in international markets is something that is a possibility. As I said, I was very optimistic with the issue of Mexico a few days ago. And I think there is no reason why Colombia could not be equally successful with a major bond issue. Now, there is also, as I said, the possibility of using the flexible credit line that Colombia has with the IMF, which is going to be renewed in a few days. That's a big question mark. I prefer actually that the credit line is taken as a balance to payments financing instrument. Now, the Banco de la República has always bought in the secondary market government bonds. It's actually been buying 2 billion pesos per month in the last few months, and it could, I think, it could potentially buy more bonds. Whether they buy it in the secondary market or the primary market is a good question. I think under certain conditions, buying in the primary market is not a bad idea. Actually, last year, when I was in the board of the central bank, we actually approved the purchase of dollars from by the Banco de la República from the government, and which was basically let's say a primary transaction, but taking into account the conditions in the secondary market. So I think it might not be a bad idea to eventually, you know, if you want to increase the bonds that the central bank buys from the government, you know, to allow some primary, some of them to be bought in the primary market.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. Moving on to Ecuador, we have two questions from the audience within, you know, the area of politics. What is the situation with the vice president? Is he resigning? And two, last week, the government made some changes in the portfolios in communications and intelligence, which has sparked criticism by senior levels of the military command. Can you give some insight, Walter, into these two comments/questions?
Yes, I can give some insight, and both questions are related. Weeks ago, Vice President Sonnenhosner took a very high profile in the fight against the pandemic. Actually, he was put in charge in the fight against the pandemic, and there were some, even some spots that appeared to promote him politically. And speculation started that he could be the president's party's selection as presidential candidate for the next elections. Then he disappeared from view, and not that he is actually disappeared, but he doesn't have a high profile as he used to have. He was no longer heading the fight against the pandemic. The Minister of Government, Maria Paula Roma, was put in that position. And then the two key people that he took to government with him, one in communications and the other intelligence, were dismissed by the president and replaced. That was the other question that was placed. So, in other words, it's evident that he has lost favor with the president and he no longer has an active role. And why that is so is subject to speculation, and the social media is rampant with all kinds of speculation, which I'm not going to repeat here because I don't know about it. And one of those speculations is that he has resigned, but there's no evidence, hard evidence of that. The point is essentially that somehow the vice president no longer wanted to have him in a high-profile position, and actually reduced his presence in the administration because he eliminated the positions they were under his control. He put other people in those positions that were closely related to the Ministry of Government, which has gained much higher profile. So whether that means that Sonnenholzer is resigning, I don't know, and I don't think anybody can say for sure other than himself whether that's true or not.
Thank you, Walter. Moving on to Peru, we have two related questions from the audience on how indigenous populations are being considered or not in government programs. I think the question is related to whether the lion's share of the help is in big cities rather than other affected areas. Do you have a view, Diego, on this topic?
Sure. So indigenous populations have also received the transfer for the $200 that the government is giving every household that is in vulnerable situation. However, there are some complications with this. One, because some of the indigenous populations do not really live close to anywhere where they can really cash out this bonus. And the other complication is more of a health concern. That is, in some of these indigenous populations, they are insulated enough so that the virus has not spread to their communities. If, however, one of them goes there to cash out the bond and buy the goods that they need and then come back infected, then of course the contagion, the possibility of enforcement, contagion protocols that are in the cities are much less likely to be enforceable in the indigenous communities, and the access to healthcare in the indigenous communities is also much more limited. So there's a serious concern over the balance that we need to have between providing some adequate means for population that are in a vulnerable situation versus increasing the rate of contagion.
Thank you, Diego. Moving on to Venezuela, Ras, a question I would have, to the extent you can comment, would be on the US presidential election cycle. How much does this matter vis-a-vis pressure, international pressure that might come Venezuela's way in coming months? And also, does the outcome of the election matter for Venezuela or not?
Oh, I get the tough ones. Okay. So Venezuela is very much on the issue in Washington. From just a purely superficial electoral position, obviously Venezuela and Cuba are very important in Florida, which Trump did carry, although he did not carry Miami and Broward counties in the last election cycle. He did carry most of the rural areas of Florida and had support there. So obviously the Cuban vote is very important, and Venezuela and Cuba are linked in U.S. policy in a lot of ways. So it is very important electorally. But I also think that there is general consensus in Washington, and I speak with them, people, everyone in Washington quite frequently, that there has to be regime change in Venezuela. And so it's not just a superficial election strategy, although that certainly helps. There is a realization that, you know, the narco traffickers in Venezuela have taken a country with the largest oil reserves in the world and brought it to bankruptcy. That this exodus of refugees of over 5 million people have left the country is a massive migration problem that is hurting everyone from Colombia, you know, as Dr. Ocampo would say, to all the way down to Peru. People walking, you know, walking all the way to Argentina from Venezuela. And now it's even more of a problem because some of them are streaming back because they lost their jobs, because they had the more menial labor, and they're trying to come back to Venezuela because there's no work for them in Colombia or the other countries, or they're not able to stay there, and the borders are closed. So that's causing another problem. The other problem that we're seeing is that those refugees who left and gone to other countries, whether they be you know, working as a waiter in New York or Miami, or menial labor in some of the other countries, or even Spain, have lost their jobs because of COVID too, as this crisis has lost them. And those people in the United States wouldn't even be eligible if they were here illegally, would not be eligible for unemployment. So they're not sending, the other problem with that is that they're also not sending remittances back to support brothers, sisters, and moms and dads and children that are stuck in Venezuela. So there's a lot of problems that are caused by that refugee problem, and that is something that's very on the forefront of policymakers in Washington. So it's not just an electoral strategy.
Thank you, Russ. Appreciate it. Going back to Jose Antonio, lots of questions on Colombia fiscal policy and you know, coordination with monetary policy. I'm going to ask two questions at once. Ecopetrol had to pay 7% yields in 10-year paper with U.S. Treasury rates at historical lows. Do you think Colombia, the sovereign, should really issue at this interest rates in U.S. dollars, or instead tap the cheaper IMF flexible credit line? And related to this, the audience seems to be quite curious about the potential consequences of unorthodox, quote unquote, fiscal monetary policy coordinations, and whether this could hurt or backfire with a country with a track record of orthodoxy.
Well, let me, I mean, the first question is an interesting one. Of course, the fact that Colombia has access to the flexible credit line of the IMF is a significant asset for the country under the circumstances. So my view is that if Colombia went to the market, it would probably not get a much lower, let's say, interest rate, effective interest rate than Ecopetrol got. I mean, that's a good question mark. I mean, we have to see. Now, but of course, the use of the flexible credit line is always a possibility, and that's a relatively inexpensive, let's say, facility. Now, the second part is an interesting question. I don't think. I mean, it depends on what you mean by unorthodox. Let's say the Colombian Banco República has always bought government bonds. I mean, that's it has a significant amount of bonds, like any other central bank of the world. Let's say has government bonds. So the real question is how much. What is the demand for liquidity, and how much that liquidity should be provided by the through the buying public sector bonds, and if so, To what extent you do it through the secondary market, as Colombia has always done, or eventually you have at least some of them purchased in the primary market, taking into account, of course, the conditions in the secondary market. As I said, last year, for example, the central bank bought dollars from the government in the primary markets, directly from the government, taking into account what were the conditions in the secondary market. So I don't think it will be totally unorthodox to eventually use that mechanism and buy some of the bonds if the quantity is significant, to buy them in the primary market. I don't think that will break the historical tradition. I mean, what will break the historical tradition is a huge amount of purchases of bonds, and not necessarily the specific mechanism that is used.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. Jumping on to Peru once again, Diego, two questions for you. One fairly specific. I'm a businesswoman who imports Peruvian manufacturing goods into the United States. Do you think there's a path forward to open commercial flights and reassume commerce? That is one. And number two, a number of participants asking about the local currency US dollar exchange rate outlook.
Sure. So about the manufacturing, international commerce activity has not been halted. You are still allowed to export. Ports are still operating to some capacity. However, what is not operating is manufacturing itself. So you may have the possibility to send the product. What you don't have is the product. So especially if we're talking with one of the products that have not been exempt from this very large overhaul of the Peruvian economy, depending on which product is it, it will probably have to wait a few weeks or even maybe a few months before it is able to be actually manufactured. Sometimes depends on if it's manufactured inside the city or if it's somewhere in the outskirts. It just depends. But the main issue here is that the manufacturing will be the bottleneck and not so much the international transport. Now, as far as for the local currency question, Peru has been really fairly good in containing the pressures imposed on the sol. We really have barely had any fluctuation taking the year as in the last 4 or 5 months. We did have a depreciation pressure, of course, when this started along with the region, but less than I would say most or all the countries in South America. And so far, it has just returned to what a little higher of what used to be the norm. Now the central bank has enough reserves to not control, but to influence the value of the dollar in the next months with no problem at all. So this has not been a main concern, and we do not anticipate it being a concern in the following months.
Thank you, Diego. Very good. Just one question came in for Russ on Venezuela. What are your views regarding recent report of a move to increase private participation in PDVSA, which is related, of course, to the appointment of the new oil ministers? Any views there, Russ?
Sure. In March, well, in February, Maduro declared an emergency in the oil industry, and he formed a presidential commission to come up with a plan to restructure the oil industry because of what we talked about earlier, that oil production is basically 19% of what it was when Chavez came to power. So one of the recommendations, they came out with a report that is still has been leaked over the last few days on March 17th, making a series of recommendations to reinvigorate the oil industry. Yesterday, Manuel Quevedo, Major General Manuel Quevedo of the National Guard, who had no oil experience but had been appointed to this position 28 months ago, and has overseen a 65% fall in oil production during his time, was summarily removed, which is appropriate since the only experience with, well, the gas industry would have been the tear gas that they used to put down protests in Venezuela. So having failed miserably, he was removed, and the heads of the commission were put into power yesterday. One is Tarek El-Assaimi, who was sanctioned by the United States. As a matter of fact, in 2017, when he was sanctioned as a drug kingpin, in the 3 months following that, the United States government found and seized over $500 million in accounts and property belonging to Tarek El-Assaimi. I don't know how well anyone else listening has done by the time of they're 42 years old and worked all in government, but that's a substantial sum of money for someone who's worked in government their whole life. He was also recently indicted by the United States for the drug crimes, and is also wanted, one of the 10 most wanted. There's a wanted poster with his picture on it. The number two, well, he is named the Minister of Oil now because Quevedo had two jobs, Minister of Oil as well as head of PDVSA. As head of PDVSA, they put in a cousin of Chavez, as Dribal Chavez, and he has some oil experience, although more importantly he has the Chavez brand on him. One of the recommendations of the commission was that they harness the power of the private market, which has done so well for other countries to bring out oil, and they want to invite private participations and private companies to invest in Venezuela and get their production up. The problem with that is that it's kind of like investing in. It's hard to take your refinery or your upgrader or your developments and leave when the government decides that they're done having you invest, which is what happened under Chavez and has happened under Maduro. So it's very hard to convince your shareholders to invest a few $1 billion. In the case of ConocoPhillips, they're still trying to get paid 12 years later, and they're owed $8.5 billion according to the World Bank's arbitration panel that awarded them $8.5 billion for the 3 ventures that they had invested in Venezuela. So it would not be for the faint of heart to invest in Venezuela, and certainly not when you can only sell your barrel of oil at $2 a barrel. So.
Thank you, Russ. In the interest of time and to keep the event tight, let's wrap up with 30-second final comments from each of you. Maybe a topic that you've been meaning to cover and you haven't been able to. Starting with Jose Antonio in Colombia. Any wrapping up remarks?
Yeah, I think the major issue for Colombia and actually for all countries is how to compensate the informal and dependent workers during lockdowns because they essentially have no income. And the longer the lockdown, the more substantial the problem. Or if there is a selective lockdown like we have now in Colombia, the sectors that continue to be closed, how you compensate the workers in those sectors. So I think that is the major problem. I actually like the idea. I have proposed something like the Peruvian solution to basically subsidize with around $120, 8 million households, which is about 70% of the households, which are the ones that you can consider poor or vulnerable.
Thank you. Walter, on Ecuador.
In Ecuador, our challenges are two. One is the government has been a laggard in putting forth policies to straighten the economic situation. And second, since we are dollarized and we do not have reserves, and we have such a huge deficit, we are in desperate need of assistance from international community, the IMF and the other multilaterals, so we can jumpstart the economy. Right now, we are illiquid and the government doesn't have the means to get the economy running. So I think that two things are connected. The government must show it's doing something to straighten the economic situation, not necessarily the problems brought about the pandemic, but the ones that were existed before. And second, this should be rewarded by the IMF and the other multilaterals so that Ecuador would be able to get out of this crisis without having a major social crisis.
Thank you. Diego, 30-second closing remarks on Peru.
Yeah, I think one of the main concerns here that we didn't address was the political side of the questions. Congress has been fairly active and with fairly populist measures in the last few weeks. Remember, this is a new Congress. It got elected in January after the dissolution of the previous one. And we are a little bit worried of the proposals that are coming out in the midst of the pandemic, not proposing price controls and proposing freezes on credits, freezes on interest accruing, and a lot of different measures that will play a huge role also in the upcoming presidential election of next year. So that's something to be concerned about and could prove eventually even more devastating than the coronavirus itself.
Thank you, Diego. Russ, to wrap up on your side, Venezuela.
Venezuela is ill-equipped to handle a pandemic at the same time as handling a famine, which is essentially what's happening. And we didn't even talk about the fact that there's no gasoline in this country with the largest oil reserves in the world. So farmers are not even able to produce or to take what little production they're producing to get it to market. So there have been pictures lately of tomatoes rotting on the side of the road because the farmers didn't have enough gasoline to get their trucks to the city. Venezuela is in a seriously bad shape. It just can't handle a famine at the same time as a pandemic. So keep your fingers crossed and pray for it.
Thank you. With that, it's been an honor for me to moderate this discussion. I'll pass it over to our organizing expert, Maria Rosa, for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Alejo. On behalf of the Andean American Association, I would like to thank this amazing panel. It's been an amazing afternoon. To share with you all your expertise. Thank you for that, and also for your frank discussion in this very challenging time. I also would like to thank all the participants that have joined with very interesting questions and have made their participation very, very, very active. I want to thank especially Jose Antonio and Walter and Diego and Ross and Alejo. And also thank our wonderful staff that makes all of this possible. Linda Calvet, our Executive Secretary, Lina Delgado, our Director of CAA, Laurie Dominguez, our Program Officer, and Lisa Wills, who is our associate. So I want to thank all of you and thanks everyone for joining. An applause for you guys. Wonderful panel.